Well, I was sent yesterday a tweet from Gospel Thought Leader on Twitter. If you're not following the Gospel Thought Leader, I highly recommend him. He is full of winsome, very even-handed advice for all of you people who don't know how the gospel applies to everyday life. He's a thought leader. He's very important in this conversation. And let me just emphasize that he is tremendously winsome. Anyway, he sent me this this video from Dr. Jemar Tisby. Now, I'm not sure if he's a doctor yet. I think he might be almost a doctor, but I'll give him his due if he's a doctor. If he's not, I'm not really sure. But Dr. Tisby here is talking to Covenant College about the long history of racism and Reformed theology. And there's a section that the Gospel Thought Leader pointed out was particularly helpful. And this is a section where Jemar is going through the Westminster Catechism, and he's talking about the Sixth Commandment. And you know, the Westminster Catechism is really good. If you haven't watched or read it, rather, I'm actually preaching through the Ten Commandments right now at my church, and it's tremendously helpful. It really gives you a full-orbed view of what each of these commandments are. Now, you might know this, you might not, so this could be a review, but when Jesus was asked what the most important commandment was, he said to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, all of that. And then the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. And really those are summaries of the Ten Commandments. The first four commandments are how to love God, and then the 6 commandments after that are how to love your neighbor. But even the 10 commandments are a summary, because there's a lot of other commandments in the Bible as well. But each commandment in the Bible fits into one of these 10 commandments. So if you want to know how to love God, there's a lot of applications for how to love God. If you want to know how to not kill and what's required in the 6th commandment, there's a lot of applications for that commandment in the Bible. And so the Catechism does a great job putting it all in one place. It's a very, very helpful thing. And so a lot of times these are much more than meets the eye. So when it says you shall not kill, there's a lot more required here, and Jemar is going to talk about that. But let's just listen to what he has to say, and then I'll respond to it, because this is a common theme in the social justice debate. I think you'll find this pretty helpful. Let's listen to Jemar.
Own life and the life of others. It's quite general, but the larger catechism holds more detail. The larger catechism says in the answer what's required. It means avoiding all occasions, temptations, and practices which tend to the unjust taking away of the life of any, and protecting and defending the innocent. So apply that to slavery. We're Christians defending the innocent. We're Christians avoiding occasions, temptations, and practices which tend to the unjust taking away of life.
He's actually right about this. I think that a lot of the sins of slavery in the United States actually were breaking the 6th commandment in various ways. I think he's actually right about that. Again, the 6th commandment is not just about murdering, although that is literally what it says. So it includes murdering, but it also includes some of the things he was talking about. He was quoting the larger catechism there, which is exactly right. I think he's right about that. Now, I would say that some Christians were breaking the 6th commandment in slavery, some Christians weren't. But it depends on the details. Jemar Tisby likes to paint in broad brushes, and that's fine. So let's just continue.
And then it goes on. What does the 6th commandment forbid? In other words, to obey the commandment, do not do these things. Forbiddeth the taking away of our own life, or the life of our neighbor unjustly, or whatsoever tendeth thereunto.
It's a good application of the 6th commandment, avoiding and forbidding things that tend towards the taking away of life. That is very true. Listen to the application he's about to make.
So might we add, in addition to slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, lynching? Here's one: the lack of access to health care.
Here's one: the lack of access to health care, after a very thoughtful pause. This is something that Jemar Tisby does a lot. In fact, this is something that every social justice advocate in the church does a lot. They'll say something that is so vague and so generic And it sounds like talking points on the progressive side, but they don't actually go so far as to talk about the actual talking point on the progressive liberal side, and so they can always deny that they said it. But Jemar Tisby will post socialistic quotes constantly, and he doesn't say whether he agrees with it or not, but it's pretty clear that he does. And so when people call him a socialist, they take offense. He's not a socialist, but it's very clear that he is actually a socialist, even if he doesn't quite know it yet. But anyway, listen to what he said. He said, "Can we add Jim Crow to this?" I think that's debatable, but I'll go with him there. Can we add lynching to the Sixth Commandment? Clearly. I mean, that's not an application. That's just literally breaking the Sixth Commandment. If you lynch a black person, and you're not the state, and you're not executing the death penalty as the state in a just way, then you are literally breaking the Sixth Commandment. That's not a profound application. That's a very clear breaking of the Sixth Commandment. And then he says lack of access to health care after a very thoughtful pause, and he says, here's one. And it all depends on what he means. It all depends on what he means. And again, this kind of a vagueness is not helpful in this conversation, but I think everyone who hears him kind of knows what he means. And what he means is healthcare as like Obamacare, essentially. Giving people access to healthcare. Because here's the thing, though. Like, he could mean a bunch of different things. So on the charitable side, we could say, if you're a Christian and you want to keep the Sixth Commandment, you cannot withhold health care from black people or Latinos just because you want to. You don't like black people, you don't like Latinos, and so you're going to withhold health care that they would otherwise have access to. So they want to pay you to heal their sickness or whatever it is, and you say, no, I don't treat Latinos here. If you're doing that and you're a Christian, you're in violation of the Sixth Commandment. That's a sin. No question about it. But that's not actually what he says. He says lack of access to health care. And so that can mean all kinds of things. That can mean if you vote against Obamacare, then you're breaking the Sixth Commandment and things like that. And that's typically what people are talking about when they say stuff like lack of access to health care. I mean, you can't just say these words in a vacuum and expect people to not assume that's what you mean. I think that is very clearly what you mean. Because here's the thing. If you wouldn't have said, here's one, lack of access to health care, unless you weren't about to say something controversial. And that is extremely controversial. In fact, it is so controversial, it's actually a sin to vote for a program like Obamacare. Because here's the thing. You can't keep God's law by breaking God's law. And so you can't say, well, I'm keeping the Sixth Commandment by breaking the commandment against stealing. Thou shalt not steal is one of the commandments. There's a great meme out there of the Good Samaritan, and he's sitting there, and he grabs the guy who's beaten up, and the Samaritan says, hold on, wait right here. I'm going to go write some laws to help you out. You know what I mean? And that's a great meme because it's not, you're not being the Good Samaritan by voting for the government to steal from people in order to give health care to other people. That's not keeping the Sixth Commandment. You cannot keep the commandment by breaking another commandment. God's law doesn't work that way. God's law requires that you love everybody with impartiality. You can't be partial to the poor. And so if you're saying, well, I'm going to steal from rich people to give to poor people, you are not treating people with impartiality. You're being very partial. You're being partial to the poor. The Bible is very specific to call out you cannot be partial to the poor. And so God's love, the love that God requires from us, is impartial. You cannot show partiality. And unfortunately, Obamacare and other kind of healthcare schemes, it's not just Obamacare, by the way, it's all the healthcare schemes that we have in the United States. They're all breaking God's commandment. So you can't keep the Sixth Commandment by breaking another commandment. It doesn't matter if it's thou shalt not steal or something else. If you're breaking one commandment to try to keep another, you're in sin. And so I would say that if you're voting for things like Obamacare, things like expansions of Medicare, or even Medicare at all that kind of stuff, that's showing partiality to the poor. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't give free health care to people. You should do that of your own volition. And so here's the thing. I think doctors would do this. If there was no Medicare, if there was no Obamacare, I think doctors would provide free services to poor people. I think they would. Now, if they didn't, are they in sin? Well, that depends. But at the end of the day, you don't have the right to their stuff. Nobody has the right to someone's labor. That's called slavery, by the way. And so if you're against slavery, you're against that kind of stuff, Dr. Tisby, then you're against any kind of idea of someone having a quote-unquote right to healthcare. Healthcare is a service. It's, no one has a right to your services. That's called slavery. That's what the slave masters, they thought they had the right to the black people's services. Anyway, that's my response to this. I thought that was very interesting, very thoughtful. Well, here's one. Access to healthcare. Well, it depends on what you mean by that, but I think everybody knows what you mean. You unfortunately don't have the courage to just be forthright with what you're saying. I think that's pervasive in the social justice space. They don't have the courage to actually say what they mean, so they give you the impression. They give you the impression, and hopefully they can trick you into thinking that healthcare access is essentially a Sixth Commandment issue. Well, it could be, depending on what you mean, but again, if you were saying something uncontroversial, like Christians should provide mercy and grace and charity to the poor, you wouldn't have said, here's one, access to healthcare. Anyway, hope this was helpful. God bless. Another thing about this video, don't fall for this rhetorical trick. If you notice, he says lynching and Jim Crow. Those are two things that are very uncontroversially evil, right? Very uncontroversially break the law of God. Everyone thinks that lynching breaks the law of God. Everybody thinks that Jim Crow breaks the law of God to some degree or another. It might not be the same law, but they both break the law. And then he throws in the one that's controversial and actually incorrect. Access to healthcare. That's a rhetorical trick, because he's basically getting you to... This is a sales trick, too. This is a salesy type of a trick. He's getting you to agree with him. Oh, yeah, lynching, that's bad. Oh, yeah, Jim Crow, that's bad. And then access to healthcare. He wants you to go with him all the way, but he hasn't proved anything. And later he says, I could say more about that. Well, Jemar, we would like you to say more, because that's where we'll know whether what you're saying is in the Bible or if it's just something you've made up and learned from somewhere else.